Right, we are now on air. I'm just muting our two participants in Chicago. We are very fortunate to have Paula Slier, the world-renowned reporter. Are you a reporter or a journalist? How do you describe yourself?
I think it's a little bit of everything, Steve. Firstly, thank you very much for having me. I spend a lot of time traveling to dangerous areas. So part of my biography reads as a war correspondent, but then sometimes in journalist circles we think we shouldn't call ourselves war correspondents because it's almost as if we want there to be a war. So some of us call ourselves peace correspondents. So I'm a mixture of a war correspondent, peace correspondent, journalist, reporter, but a person who really likes the world of news and tries to be where the news is happening.
Okay, but now, from what you've said, you indicated that you like news and obviously you want to report the news, but from what I understand, you are gravitating towards situations that are particularly dangerous. Why would you go there?
Well, my father says it's because I didn't eat enough vegetables when I was a little girl. So, short of that, it's not something I always dreamed about. It wasn't that I was at school and I dreamed about going to dangerous areas. I did dream about being a journalist. I always thought that it would be exciting to meet different people every day. And it's true. When you're a journalist, you can, in the morning, do a story with homeless people, and these people have absolutely no money, no home, no food. And then in the evening, you could be interviewing the president of the country, and you're going from the one extreme to the other. And the best part about journalism is that people let you into their homes. So I've sat in homes in Iraq, Afghanistan, Israel, Gaza, and I've spoken to people about absolutely everything under the sky, every single subject you can imagine. War journalism kind of happened along the way because a lot of the stories, unfortunately, that are making the news headlines today are stories that are happening in dangerous areas. So that's how I kind of found my way into it.
Okay, so now, in terms of where you first started, you mentioned that you always wanted to be a journalist. Where you started out in South Africa. Yay, South Africa!
Yay,
and then obviously you studied journalism. Is that how it worked? And then you chose to go into like TV reporting or just writing articles for newspapers. I mean, how did it all follow through with you?
I didn't study journalism, and the funny thing is that most of the journalists that I work with today did not study journalism. I don't know how many careers that's true for, but you don't need to study journalism to become a journalist. You just need to be really curious about the world. You need to be very interested and wanting to ask questions and wanting to hear different answers, and understanding that there's not one answer for every question, particularly because I work in the Middle East, where there are so many conflicts. You can have one question to people on opposite sides of a conflict and they'll both give you very different answers to the same question. So you need to have an open mind and be curious and want to learn. I was at school and I started writing. I never thought I'd be a television journalist. I thought I would write for newspapers, and I used to write for the youth section of the Star newspaper, which was the local newspaper in Johannesburg. And then I went to university and I studied politics and philosophy. And while I was at university, I started volunteering at the local television station, which is the South African Broadcasting Corporation. And I worked for nothing for 2 years. And eventually, after 2 years, somebody came to me and said, "You work so hard and you're prepared to do anything. Imagine how hard you'll work if we actually give you a job and pay you." And I think that was one of my most important lessons, was that something like television journalism is very difficult to get into. But if you're prepared to put in the hours, and if you're hardworking and you really want something, it will come true. And that's really put me in good stead in my whole life, is that, for example, moving to the Middle East from South Africa 9 years ago, I knew nobody in this part of the world. And now I work as the Middle East correspondent for Russia Today, and I'm one of their main journalists. And I don't know Russian, and I didn't know the Russian world, but I really wanted to have this job. And so the hard work and the dedication and really wanting something, I really think then everything can come true.
Now, Janet, who is with us in the room, just asked a question. She wants to know, do you have any problems as a woman being taken seriously, especially in some of the places where you travel, and it with special focus on the Middle East, because obviously there are different how can I put it, customs towards men and women and the way one relates to each other?
Janet, thank you for the question. I mean, people often ask me that question in different capacities. So it's the same question you ask, as often people say to me, well, is it an advantage or a disadvantage being a woman, particularly in the Middle East, where it can be quite a chauvinistic culture? The other question is it not more dangerous for women? I've spent a lot of time, for example, in Cairo, in Tahrir Square, where there were women who were being raped and there were charges of sexual harassment. So as a woman, is it not more dangerous for me going to those dangerous places? And the answer to both your question and these other questions is that it's actually turned out to be an advantage. The advantage is that I think as women, we tell a different kind of news. So I will go into, let's say, a home, and I will see things differently to a male journalist, particularly in times of war. I think as women journalists, we almost find the human stories more easily than men. I know I'm generalizing, but the answer is a generalized answer. The other thing is that I have access that male journalists don't have. So, for example, in Afghanistan, we were interviewing fighters, the mujahideen, and these are the men that walk around with their faces completely covered, and their wives never leave the kitchen. Now, if I was a male journalist and I went to these people's home, I would never be allowed into the kitchen to interview the wives. But because I'm a woman, I can go into the kitchen and I can talk to the woman, and I'm, number one, allowed to go there, and number two, I'm less threatening. So the woman will talk to me. And I think the less threatening thing is important, because often I'll be in a situation where there is a lot of, I've just come back from Ukraine, where it's very dangerous at the moment. And most of the people are fighters with guns, but the moment there's a woman in their presence, I think it almost calms people down. It's almost like they're less violent because there's a woman around. And so in my experience, it's always been an advantage being a woman. It is a little bit more dangerous in some situations, but we do training, and I've done courses. I'm not saying the courses are 100% foolproof, but you can learn how to be safer in situations. There are skills that we learn for those kind of circumstances. So my short answer is that it's actually been an advantage being a woman.
Wow. Okay. So I mean, obviously it's not just the Middle East that you're focusing on. Which countries have you traveled to? And out of all your experiences, which would you say have been the most dangerous ones?
So I'm focused mostly on the Middle East. I would say I've traveled to Israel, Palestine, Gaza. Gaza can be dangerous. I've been there during war times, and the danger, it's not necessarily only Gaza, it's any country when you're there during war. The danger is being fired on and bullets exploding. I've been in Lebanon. I was in Lebanon during the Israeli-Lebanon Second World War, and that was also quite dangerous. I've been in Afghanistan, where I had a very near miss. Our hotel was bombed and 11 people were killed, and we had left the hotel 15 minutes before it happened. And why I say it was a close miss was that every morning at 9 o'clock in the morning, I would go to the entrance of the hotel, me and the cameraman, and we would catch our taxi driver. We used the same taxi driver and our translator, and we would meet at this point in front of the hotel. And that day when the bomb went off, it went off at 9 o'clock, which was exactly the time we used to meet our taxi driver every morning, and it went off at the exact spot where we used to meet him. It was just pure chance that that day, and it was the only day in 1 month of working in Afghanistan, we left 15 minutes early. So, you know, if we hadn't, we would have been killed. That was a near miss in Afghanistan. I've reported from Iraq. As I said, I've just come back from Ukraine. I spent 3 months in Ukraine, and the situation in Ukraine is very dangerous at the moment now. I work for Russian television. So we were working with the Russian fighters, or the pro-Russian Ukrainian fighters. And 2 days ago, 2 of my friends were killed in Ukraine, 2 journalists who were killed with a mortar at a checkpoint. So, you know, some of it is also just luck, whether you get caught or whether you don't.
Absolutely. I mean, so now obviously, if you're working for Russian television, then the fact that you are in Ukraine, there's a lot of tension going on between the Russians and Ukraine, or isn't it? I mean, you obviously see things that we don't always get to see, because as you know, what gets reported doesn't necessarily have to be what's actually going on the ground. Sometimes they are wagging the dog. If you understand the experience.
I want to say 2 things. I want to say, number one, that Nothing is black and white in the world, and that's something I've learned. You know, for example, I've covered for many years the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and it's two different people that are looking at the same situation, as I said earlier, and have completely different opinions. And if anybody says to me, okay, so you've been talking to Israelis for 9 years and you've been talking to Palestinians for 9 years, who do you think is right? Firstly, it's not my job as the journalist to say I think this person's right or that person's right. My job as the journalist is just to tell people's stories. But what I have learned is that both people are right. You know, there's truth and justice on everybody's side. And so everybody in a conflict has tragedy, everybody has suffering, everybody has truth. And that's been a huge lesson about the world, is that it is not so clear-cut. And I think sometimes as journalists, because we try to explain very complicated stories to people in a different country, we don't always explain the stories properly, because it's so hard to explain the history and the context and the feelings. And in a television story, it can be 2 minutes. How do you explain something like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in 2 minutes? But the other part of your question was, you know, things are not always what they seem. It's television. If you watch Russian television, you're watching Russian television. It's television from a Russian point of view. If you watch BBC, it's television from a British point of view. So it's not that any one television channel out there is the objective truth. I think we need to learn to be very careful, not careful, but we need to be sophisticated. The same way you wouldn't just ask one person their opinion and assume that that's the right opinion. When you come to understanding the world, use as many different television stations, as many different newspapers as you can to hear as many different points of view, and then people can make up their mind because they're better informed about what they think is the reality on the ground.
Have you ever been accused of bias? Because at the end of the day, it's your job as a journalist to report what is supposedly the facts. But then someone might say, well, we're thinking that maybe your facts are a little bit towards one side or another side. And how do you respond to that?
I definitely get accused of bias. I mean, the fact that I am working for a Russian television channel, people will say, well, you're only showing the Russian point of view. And it's not just about facts. I mean, one story that I remember, there was a couple of years ago, there was a suicide bombing in Israel, and a lot of children were killed. And the woman who carried the suicide bomber to the restaurant was arrested and sent to prison. And she was then released from prison, and today she's living in Jordan. And I went and interviewed her. And I wanted to interview the mother of one of the children who was killed. And the mother said to me, how can you put me as the mother who lost her daughter in the same television story as this woman who helped carry out the suicide bombing? You're not a journalist. And it was such a difficult situation, because my role as the journalist is to let everybody have their point of view. But according to that mother, the fact that I was prepared to give a woman who had assisted in a suicide bombing an opportunity to tell why she did that and what was her experience and why she was involved, I had crossed a black line for her. So facts and who you choose to interview is very different. You know, I'm trying to keep as open a mind as possible and interview everybody, but it's the question of, like, can I interview a terrorist, or or have I gone too far? And what is a terrorist? Because one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. So I get accused of interviewing people that sometimes people say should not be given the opportunity to be on television. I get accused of the fact that I work for a Russian television channel of showing the Russian point of view. I get accused of not interviewing enough people for a story, and I get accused of interviewing too many different opinions for a story. And I think all of those criticisms are fair. I think it is accurate. And I think that's the challenge to us as journalists, is just to try in an imperfect world and do the best job we can, knowing that it is a hard job because there's so much information out there and there's so many different opinions to one particular story.
Is there a wealth of information to the point where, you know, there's enough cake for everyone? Or do you find that there's a little bit of a competitive edge where your news agency has to break the news before someone else? Or do you find that it's a collaborative effort that you work together with other agencies and you break it at the same time? Is there some sort of competitive edge going on?
Stephen, it's a great question. There's a huge competitive edge, and it's not to the advantage of journalism today. When I started as a journalist 20 years ago, we were taught that you never report the news until you have at least two independent sources that confirm it. But today, I mean, when I grew up, there was only CNN. I only grew up watching CNN. Today, you have my channel, Russia Today. You have CCTV, which is Chinese TV. You have France 24, which is French. And I'm only talking about different channels in English. You know, let's not even. You have maybe about 15, 24-hour English news channels today, and you have the same in Arabic, the same in French, the same in Spanish. Now, we're all competing with the same audience to some extent. So why I want somebody to watch my channel. So we want to get out there with the news quicker than somebody else. So we are in competition with each other because we're trying to get people to watch us. So what happens, and this is true for all the news channels, is news is happening so quickly today because we're in a world that we're able to report on it so quickly. And I think we're not necessarily becoming better journalists. We're reporting the news so we can be first with the competition, and we're not checking our facts like maybe journalists were doing 20 years ago. So that's why if you watch the news carefully, and it's all the news channels are guilty of this, we will report something and then you might find like 2 or 3 hours later we'll say, well, that wasn't accurate, and in fact this is what happened. But instead of waiting till we know the facts, we're not, because everybody's in competition with everybody else.
Sure. So now you've got competition. Is it possible that perhaps sometimes one might, and I'm not saying this that you're being mischievous, but one might lead with a story just because that would get you the break?
I mean, I would want to say no. I would want to say that as journalists we believe in a higher truth, and I think that's true for most of us. But I do think that the competition, the pressure, I think it opens the possibility that journalists are maybe not as thorough and we're not as careful about our facts and our reporting as we were before. We are more enthusiastic about potentially having a breaking news story. But the other element is also true. It's, you know, I work in dangerous areas. So you could ask me just the same question. You could say, would journalists, because they want to have a break, put themselves in a very dangerous situation? Because if they survive that situation, it can be a fantastic news story and they can have their name made. But the risk they pay is we're playing with our lives. And the truth is that we are pushing ourselves. I think journalists today put themselves in extremely difficult, extremely dangerous situations because of what you mentioned. People want to be the journalist who broke the story. So yes and no is my answer. We're doing it more than probably is healthy.
Okay, well now to take it to the other extreme, while you've mentioned that some journalists are not so conscientious when it comes to checking facts, what about the ones that are so intrusive about getting the facts that they, as you know, in the UK, have been bugging people's cell phone messages and listening to all the voicemails of celebrities and then the paparazzi going a little bit further and taking intrusive photographs? Sometimes they will provoke a reaction just to get the right photo, and that photo brings in money. So, I mean, while you're just reporting, if you're working with a TV channel that is going to have the first few photographs of a celebrity that is caught without their clothes on, that's going to make the news, and that becomes newsworthy.
I think it's a very sad reflection on journalism. I mean, what is journalism? Journalism is supposed to be, I think journalism means different things to different people. For me, journalism is a way of bringing the world to people. So you're sitting in South Africa and you switch on your news tonight and you can see what happened in Iraq today. And it can be interesting or not interesting to you. And I see my role as the journalist to try and tell you as honestly and as objectively as I can what happened in Iraq today, or if there was a bomb blast in Iraq, you know, what happened, who died, why did it happen. I really believe my role as a journalist is to try and be objective and to try and be as honest as I can with people I talk to in sharing their story. I personally have a very real problem when we become the story. So when we're creating a story, when we're going and, like you say, intrusive into people's lives just so that we can get a photo that I think there are lines that people cross as journalists, and I think, if our profession is to be a noble profession and is to be a profession about bringing the world to people, why do we want to go across that line and mess up the world and intrude into people's homes? I have a problem with it. The other example that comes to mind is many years ago when I was working in South African TV. I remember we arrived at a press conference. And as we arrived, the health minister stood up. We were like 40 minutes late. And she said, okay, the South African Broadcasting Corporation, SABC, has arrived. Now we can begin. And we find that often, I will go to a place and nobody will be demonstrating. The minute we take out the camera, everybody starts screaming and yelling and shouting. And the minute we leave, they stop doing it. And that's also a problem with journalists. We're not supposed to be creating the news. We're just supposed to be reporting the news. So that's part of the question you asked me. Is I think our role is the observer. We're not supposed to be inside the story. And I think, unfortunately, people use journalists to tell their messages. So people might wait until there's a TV crew to do something just so that it can go on the news. And if there was no TV crew, it wouldn't have happened. And there's sad examples of that. There's examples of people being killed because a TV crew arrived. Whereas maybe if there was no TV crew, the situation wouldn't have got out of control to the extent that it did.
Sure. And what I find fascinating is that social media is playing a massive role in news dissemination. So if I want to get information out very quickly, I could just post one line on Facebook and within a few minutes it's out there. If I post one tweet, it's out there. Do you find that sometimes if you keep your finger on the pulse on Facebook or on Twitter, that you are picking up stories faster than you could get them before? I mean, do you have people who just monitor the internet channels just to see what's going on?
And the social media is it's taken journalism to a whole new world. I mean, I was in Egypt during the revolution, as I said, and I think that revolution was almost what people say the Twitter revolution. People tweeted by the second what was happening when Mubarak fell. And I find Twitter phenomenal. Like, for me, Twitter is the most fantastic source of knowing what's going on. And it's equally just as fantastic a bad idea for helping me with my journalism. And why? Because you never know if the information is accurate or not. You can have people tweeting that can be completely false. So it's about finding, obviously, the journalists or the sources you trust, and you follow them on Twitter. But, there are a lot of people out there who have very, very valuable information and who are tweeting. And I'm not accessing that information because, number one, there's just so much information out there. It's hard to even make your way through it. Number two, I don't know who those people are. And I'm very suspicious now because there's so much nonsense being tweeted. It's hard to find the tweets that are reliable if you don't know who the person is already. The other problem with social media is that everybody now is a journalist. If everybody's tweeting and if everybody's blogging and if everybody can pick up their cell phone and take photos and put that on YouTube, this is a question we as journalists are asking ourselves. What does it mean for the future of journalism when everybody is a journalist, when everybody is a cameraman? And that's why I go back to my previous point that as journalists, we have to be held up to a higher standard. I think what separates me from the Joe Schmo on the street who just goes and takes cell phone shots has to be that over the years, even though I didn't study journalism, I have perfected the art of journalism. There has to be something that makes me a journalist and not everybody a journalist. And that's why when journalists abuse that and we start doing too much of this paparazzi, we are doing a disservice to our own profession. So on the social media, I think it's a fantastic source, but I also think it can be a very dangerous source, and it's learning who you can rely on, what you can rely on, and being very careful that you don't start reporting on myths and on inaccurate facts.
Okay, well, let me ask you this. I mean, I'm a maths guy, so obviously I see the patterns in everything. Do you see an escalation in sensational stories to the point where the audience are desensitized to what is supposedly sensational until the next sensational thing comes along. And it's got to be even more sensational than the last one. And eventually, when you tell me that, for example, there were 10 car bombs in the middle of Afghanistan, I don't blink twice because it's happening all the time. I've been desensitized towards it. Is there going to be a point where nothing is going to impress us anymore?
Stephen, you're 100% right, and it is a concern because, yes, I mean, you asked me about competition, and my answer was that as journalists, we're competing with each other so that Stephen Sherman watches us on television. And part of how you beat the other competition is what we spoke about before, being the first person to report on something, even if you're not sure of the facts. And part of beating the competition is sensationalizing the news. So we have a saying in journalism, if it bleeds, it leads. You know, you're never going to have your headlines. The headlines will never be that dog bit man. The headline will be that man bit dog. It has to be sensationalist for people to want to watch it. I worked, as I said, at the South African Broadcasting, SABC, and I remember at one stage we had a sign in the newsroom that said, "Don't worry, something bad will happen soon." You know, and we laugh, but it's sick, and but it's the world in which we live. And also in South Africa, there was a time when we were having so many motor car accidents that the news editor took a decision that unless more than, and I don't remember the figure, but let's just say 10, unless more than 10 people were killed in a road car accident, we were not going to report on the news. So there is so much happening that we are becoming desensitized, and the problem of that is that we're having to sensationalize our news, as you said, even more to make people take notice. I remember many years ago there was a picture on a newspaper in South Africa. There were a lot of people who were dying in Zimbabwe, a lot of farm killings. And for days and weeks, the newspapers had been showing pictures of dead farmers. And out of all those pictures, what is the one I remember? I remember the picture of a dog standing on top of the dead body of his owner. And I remember that dog's face. That I was so desensitized to seeing pictures of dead people. I had to see a picture of a dog to feel the sadness and the tragedy that was unfolding. And I think that's one of the problems with media in general. Today you go onto YouTube, Syria. Syria is another country I've reported from. There are massacres in Syria all the time. If you watch YouTube videos, they are horrendous, particularly because people are filming them with their iPhones and there's no kind of channels of you know, on TV journalism, we don't show everything. We don't put everything out there. We will hide faces and we won't show the most gruesome things. But on YouTube, there's some pretty gruesome stuff that's appearing. So when people are watching, you know, videos that are terrible in terms of people dying, they become desensitized. So how do you make people care again? It really is a vicious circle.
Do you try and balance it out with good stories, the kind of heartwarming stories that people need hope to see?
The truth is people don't, you know, if you watch news carefully, the heartwarming stories are never the headlines. So the first part of the news is always going to be the dramatic stories. In some news channels, we have what we call lighter stories towards the end of the news. So you might have a story about a feel-good story that a man lost his wife for a couple of years and then found her, whatever. But those stories will always make it towards the end of the news. It's back to what we were saying. We're living in a world today, unfortunately, for whatever reasons, and it's part of the media, we're definitely to blame, that is desensitized to that and wants sensationalism. So we're giving, maybe they don't want sensationalism, but we as journalists are giving them that sensationalism. So there are feel-good stories, and I mean, that's my own personal thing. I would much rather tell a story about people and humanity and how we are actually good for each other than I would about this horror and this tragedy. And I think they've tried once or twice to have news channels that were only about good news, but there just were not enough people that were interested in watching that kind of news.
Sure. Well, I mean, we've got quite an audience that have joined us already. We have Maria, we have Effie all out in Greece, and Louise also in the USA. Do you guys have any questions that you'd like to ask Paula? I have put you on mute, but I can unmute you. You can unmute yourself if you want to ask a question. If not, you can always just type it in the text, and we can always ask Paula while we're chatting. What I find interesting is that, you know, news is as you said, We also have Govinda from Nepal. How can we forget Govinda? You know, we find that news is everywhere. There is so much. We don't know what to believe sometimes. I mean, on Facebook, someone will post, you know, can you believe this celebrity passed away? And then all of a sudden, there's a whole tribute page. Meanwhile, the celebrity is absolutely fine. You know, so sometimes when we hear the news, we might just say, oh, please, there's no ways that that's going to happen, or that is, because it just doesn't seem right. Do you find that a lot of people just don't believe some of the things you want to say?
No, funny enough, I find the opposite. I mean, I'm reading some of the comments people say, and maybe I'm wrong in my perception, but I have always found that people have, I don't know where it comes from, but because it's on television, it must be true. Okay. And it's wrong. You know, as journalists, we do sometimes get our stories wrong. And like I was saying to you earlier, there's no one truth. So I could do a story about Syria, and I could tell you how the people living in Damascus feel. And the truth is most of them support Assad. But there's just as many people who do not support Assad. But I almost feel like when somebody says something on TV, in my experience, people have taken that to have more credibility than if it was something that was just made in conversation. There's something almost like the power of television. So my feeling is different. I mean, I don't know if other people listening have you know, agree or disagree with me or you.
Well, I know, Louise, you wanted to ask something. Is that correct?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can.
Yeah.
Yeah, when you were talking about the picture of the dog, that reminded me of that picture, and I think it was taken a while back, but there was a little boy in Africa who was just about to die of starvation, and in the background you could see the vulture just waiting to pounce on it as soon as he died. And that really, and I just saw that picture recently for the first time. And because we've seen so many pictures of kids like that, and we see them on commercials, we see them, and we do get desensitized. But when I saw that picture of that bird waiting for this little child to die, it just really hit me, and I'm thinking, gosh, you know, just these kinds of images are so powerful, but yet we just see them all the time now, and it's just really hard to really think as clearly about them as we really should.
I mean, am I on air? Yeah, I can respond, Stephen.
We can hear you. Yeah, go for it.
That photo was taken by a guy, Kevin Carter, and it's a really interesting story what went on behind it. He won the Pulitzer Prize for that photograph, and it touched so many people, and the fact that it even touches you and me so much later just shows the power of that image. I think so many people are familiar with it. But interestingly enough, and tragically, he landed up killing himself. And a lot of the thinking around that was, after that photograph was published, as much as it moved people, he came under a lot of criticism for not doing something to help the child. And it's something that we're often, it's a challenge we're faced as journalists, is I remember some of the criticism was, why didn't he pick up the child and move it away from the vulture? Or why didn't he pick up the child and take it to the feeding center that was nearby? It's a question, it's an ethical question I face as a journalist. If I'm in a situation and I see that somebody's about to be killed, do I record that sequence of events, or do I put my camera down and go and help that person? And I'm not sure there's definitely one answer, because the fact that you remember this picture shows how powerful that picture was. Probably does a lot more good, that people would argue in that respect, than if he hadn't taken the photo and had just taken the kid to the feeding center. But on the other hand, you know, the argument against that is just as powerful. He struggled with that dilemma. I'm not saying that that was the reason he took his life, but I'm just saying it was a very tragic story. But that is one of the most, that is a remarkable photograph, and it certainly has touched so many people. You know, there was a lot of necklacing in South Africa at one stage where news cameramen were filming people dying. They would put tires around people and burn them to death. And as journalists, we were trained to film everything. And only when you get back to the newsroom do you make an ethical and an editorial decision. I'm going to show that on air. I'm going to stop it here. I'm going to not stop it there. we were trained as journalists that the job is to record everything, and that our contribution is in the recording, and that I go to these dangerous areas as a journalist, not as a social worker, or not as an activist. But I'm human, and I'm not sure I would 100% always respond as a journalist in some situations. I would hope to think I'd respond as a human being as well.
So then, obviously, with your own personal feelings towards particular political topics, you studied politics, so you would know that there's certain, perhaps, a bias towards a particular political feeling that you might have, and then all of a sudden you spend almost 20 years in the Middle East, and you start to change your opinion on certain things because of what you're exposed to. Do you find that that tends to happen a lot, where you are now seeing both sides, but you're seeing the facts from both groups, and your opinion keeps changing?
My opinion does keep changing, but my personal challenge, and if you had another journalist talking to you today, they might not say the same thing. My personal challenge is, am I meant to have an opinion as a journalist? You know, sometimes I get invited to panels and they ask me, Paula, what's your opinion of what you saw on the ground? And it's often a conflict for me, because surely, you know, there's part of me that thinks I'm not supposed to have an opinion. I'm a journalist, I've gone there just to record the situation. And there's another part of me that's like, for example, it was very difficult getting into Libya. I reported from Libya when Gaddafi was in his final days. And I do have an opinion of what was happening there. But, you know, is that my role? Is my role to have been the reporter, and one of the reporters in Libya at that period, walk away and say, this is what I saw, this is what I think is happening? Or is my role just to say, this is what people said, this is what was seen, and you as the viewer make up your own mind? Certainly, if you're asking me on a personal thing, my opinion often changes when I go to a place. And sometimes I think that maybe that's one of the downfalls of journalism. We try and bring the world to people. And because of the constraints of journalism, because television is just a box and it's very impersonal in some ways, we don't always tell the stories properly. But when I go to these places, I research before I go, and I have an idea of what the story is about. And 99% of the time I go there and I meet people and I talk to people, and it's not always what I think it is. In fact, most times it's not, because people are so complicated and because stories are so complicated. So yes, if you're asking me about my opinion changes all the time. I'm just not 100% sure that as a journalist, my role is to share my opinion with people. I still would like to think that, and I still think I do think that my role is to try and let people tell what they think, and people make up their own mind. There's a question from Effie, like how far can we as journalists distance ourselves? And I like that question. Journalists are not supposed to interfere, but how far can they distance themselves? It's a good question, because it's our challenge. It's something I struggle with. You know, I 3 months in Ukraine now, talking to pro-Russian fighters. And I was spending all my time with them, and I was talking to people who had lost family. I'm a human being. At the end, I almost empathize with them. Of course I'm going to empathize with them. You're always going to empathize with people who you spend time with, and you hear their stories, and they let you into their homes. How far can we distance ourselves? It's a good question, because there's a part of me that thinks as a journalist we're supposed to distance ourselves. We're supposed to be as neutral and as objective. But on the other hand, I'm also sometimes thinking I'm a good journalist, because if somebody tells me a terrifyingly sad story and they're crying and they're traumatic, I sometimes do cry during an interview with the person I'm interviewing, because it is so sad what they're sharing with me. And I'm not sure me really feeling their pain makes me a worse journalist. Sometimes I think it even makes me a better journalist, because I can imagine and tell their pain. But of course, there were those that would say that's not my role. My role is to be as removed as possible and not to get emotionally involved. So it's no right and wrong answer.
Well, I mean, look, it's a human endeavor. I mean, you're working with people, and you are a person, and emotions. I mean, you can't just switch off emotions when you go into a situation. And in particular, the kind of situations that you're putting yourself through. You said that you had a close call with a bomb at the hotel. Surely you're driving a vehicle and there are IEDs and that type of thing around. When you're going to interview people who are described as terrorists from the one side but freedom fighters as the other, do you feel safe when you do so? Do you travel around with bulletproof vests? I mean, what sort of precautions do you take?
You know, I feel like I'm answering all your questions by saying these are real challenges, but they are. Because, Steve, that's another question that as journalists we face on a daily struggle, the question of how to be safe. Now, the first time I went to Afghanistan, we had security guards. We spent, I think it was $1,000 a day, and every time we stepped out of the hotel to go somewhere, there was a huge vehicle behind us of Afghan guys with AK-47s. Did I feel safer for that? I felt completely less safe, because everywhere we went, there was a car with armed men behind me. So if anybody wanted to have the impression that somebody important, in inverted commas, was traveling and they wanted to carry out a suicide bombing or make a statement, I was like a perfect target, because it was like, hey, look, there's obviously something that's Western that you can target. So it's also the question we as journalists struggle with. I don't know if we struggle with it, but it is a question we ask ourselves before every time we deploy to a dangerous area, is do we take security? And most times it's yes, but in what form does that security take? Is the security going to be security guards? Or, like the second time I went to Afghanistan, we caught local taxis and we just completely blended in with the local population, and we felt even more safe because it was not so obvious that there was a Western television crew moving through the cities. So it depends on the country you're reporting in, and it depends on the circumstances. But one thing I do think, and I think most journalists would agree with me, is that 20 years ago, journalists were not the target. In a conflict zone, there was an understanding that the journalists were the impartial observer. In recent years, journalists have become a legitimate target. For example, bulletproof vests. So when we go to a dangerous area, we wear body armor. The question is, should the body armor have the word media written on it or not? Now, you would automatically think that if it says media, people would not aim at us. They would understand that we are impartial and we're not involved. I'm talking, for example, I'll give you one example with the American troops. We went on an embed in Afghanistan. And so we, of course, are not going to wear American uniforms, armored uniform, because we're not part of the army, but we wore our own bulletproof jackets and things. The same time I was in Afghanistan, a woman journalist and her cameraman were targeted and killed. And how did they know to target them? Because they looked for the media sign and they aimed for it, because they wanted to target whatever they were American journalists, that organization. So we ask ourselves the question: do we identify ourselves as media? Do we not identify ourselves as media? That is one of the worrying things about the world of journalism, or the world of conflict journalism today, is that it's become increasingly dangerous. And I said to you earlier that 2 of my colleagues were killed earlier this week in Ukraine. They work for Russian television, and the Russian government believes, and certainly at this stage, this is what is the belief until proven otherwise, that they were deliberately targeted because they were Russian journalists. So it might turn out not to be true, but the world we're living in today is a world that is targeting journalists more and more.
Wow. I mean, so why do you do it? I mean, you've just told us how dangerous it is, how unsafe you feel, yet you plunge straight into it. And that wherever they ask you to go, there is a huge new uprising in this part of the Middle East, and you're like, pick me, pick me. Why would you do it?
So now you sound like my father, who has exactly the same question every time I get deployed. Except his is a little bit like, why would you put your father through this? And there are noble reasons and there are not noble reasons. And the truth is, it's both. The not so noble reasons, which I'm a little bit embarrassed to tell you, but they are true, it's almost like an addiction, you know. It's like skydiving, you know. I guess if you ask people who do extreme sports, why do you do an extreme sport where you risk your life? There's an adrenaline rush. So when I'm traveling to a war zone, or when I don't know why I'm remembering now being on a military helicopter over Afghanistan, and the guys were all holding guns, and I was really frightened. It was like any moment we could be shot down, and when you're in a helicopter, there's nowhere to run. So, but mixed with that kind of fear is an adrenaline rush. So there is that element of it that I'm not so proud of, but it is true. There's also the excitement of being at the most important news story that's happening at that moment. You know, Like the whole world is talking about, let's say, Ukraine, and I'm there. I'm in the middle of the story. It's exciting. And then there are the elements that are more noble. There are the elements of like, well, I want to try and go there and give it my best shot and try and tell the story. And if I can do a little bit of good by maybe helping break down stereotypes and give people information. A lot of journalists do believe that the public has the right to know, and I sometimes believe that, and sometimes I think not everything needs to be known, but that's not necessarily the discussion, but there's an element of that, like maybe the public does need to know or should know. A tsunami is an easy story for me. I went to the tsunami immediately after it happened, and and earthquakes. I've covered a lot of earthquakes in my career. I do those stories even though they're dangerous because I think I'm helping. I think if I go to an earthquake zone and I can show the world how people are struggling and what's happened there, we can help bring in human aid. We can help people donate money. We can help make people care for each other. So there's certainly an element of wanting to help people as well. So it's a mixture of being a noble person and a less noble person.
Wow. Okay, that was a pretty good answer. I figured that there would be an element of being a...
Stephen, I'm not hearing you.
Oh, am I on mute? No? Can you hear me now?
Okay.
Is that better? I would think that possibly that obviously danger would feature because anyone...
No, I can hear you now. I can hear you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Anyone who volunteers to go into danger clearly has some sort of, not addiction, but a preference for it. But as you said, there is a noble aspect as well where you want to help and make a difference. So do you feel that with all your experience, you are ready to solve the Middle East crisis? We want to help.
You know what I think? I don't know if this is the answer that I should say, but it's the truth. I think that after living in the Middle East, I'm more confused about what's happening here than I was before I came to live here. And I think that's the truth about the world in which we live. And that's what I've been trying to say about journalism. We're trying to explain the world to people, but it's a very gray world. It's not black and white. Conflict journalism is never one side versus the other side. Conflict journalism is one side versus the other side versus the other side, what the international powers, what their interests are, what people on the ground think, how the economy is involved, how the society is involved, how the history is involved. There's so many factors. So I think that you asked me why I like doing this, because it's exciting, because it's almost like the university of life. It's trying to understand the world in which we live, and the more I travel the world, the more I don't understand it, so the longer my university continues, and that's exciting. I think, and it goes back to what we're saying at the beginning, like why would someone want to be a journalist? Because you're curious about the world, because you want to learn more. And the more you learn about how much there is still for you to learn.
So the cycle continues. You've obviously had the privilege of interviewing...
Steve, I'm not hearing you.
I think there's quite a long delay. You've had the privilege of interviewing presidents and people from all spectrums. Who has been the most interesting person that you've interviewed?
Oh, no one's. I mean, that sounds like an obvious question, but no one's ever asked it to me, so I'm a bit stumped. I mean, I had the privilege of interviewing Mandela. It wasn't a long interview, so that's why he doesn't come up as my first person, because it wasn't an interview that I could get into with him. But I can say about Mandela that he was one of those people that had an aura. I never felt that, you know, I'm not someone that buys into all of that stuff about idols and everything, but that man had a presence about him. When he walked into a room, you could feel that he was in the presence of a great leader. Other presidents and people I've interviewed, I have to be honest, no one really comes to mind. I'm almost tempted to say to you that I walk away from an interview and I feel really moved. It's not really because the person was a big name. It's sometimes because, it's more often than not, because the person went through something in their life and I'm deeply touched by their story. So, for example, it would be someone who survived a particular situation, whether it was a bombing or whether it was a trauma. I'm just remembering now, many years ago, I did a story in the Middle East, in Israel. I visited an Israeli hospital, and there was one ward where you had two 16-year-old girls. The one was Palestinian and the one was Israeli. And they were both in the same hospital ward. And the Palestinian girl, she was driving in a car in Bethlehem, and the Israelis made a mistake, and they shot that car. And her sister, who was 13 years old, died next to her. And this girl, Marianne, was in the hospital recovering. And just a few beds away from her was an Israeli girl, Adit, who had been at a pizzeria in Jerusalem when a suicide bombing had gone off. And she had had bolts and all kinds of metal blown into her body, and she was learning how to walk after 16 operations. And a few years ago, I got a Facebook message from Marianne, who was the Palestinian girl, saying, thank you, I remember you from that day, and I remember you being kind, and I remember you asking me how I felt. The story I did was how two young girls are victims of a conflict that's so much bigger than they are. And I was really touched by their stories because neither of those girls were speaking with hatred. They were both just speaking about two young girls who wanted to live their lives and had been caught up in a circumstance that was bigger than them. And I was really touched when Christine got hold of me and said, I remember you being kind to me, and I want to be a journalist like you. I was really, really touched by that story. So those are the kind of the interviews and the stories that touch me the most.
Okay, if you could make a wish list of some of the people that you could interview.
Stephen, I'm not hearing you.
There's about a 5-second delay. I'll type it out. If you could make a wish list.
Oh, I can hear you now.
If you could make a wish list of people that you could interview, who would you choose?
Who would I choose for my wish list of people to interview? I always wanted to interview Gracia Michelle. I'd love to interview Gracia Michelle. I think as the only woman to have been married to 2 presidents, I think that she would have a wealth of. I would like to interview her. I would like to interview the Russian President Putin because I've traveled so much of the world and everybody's always got an opinion on him. I need to think about this one. You know what the funny thing is, and my mom always says to me, for some reason she's always asked me this question, don't you run out of stories? Don't you run out of people to interview? And we never run out of stories because everybody has at least one story to tell. So I can tell you with complete confidence that I could interview absolutely anybody in the world, and everybody would ultimately be interesting, because we might not feel we're that interesting individually, but each of us have our own story, and that's all that journalism is stories, and stories are people. So I need to think. I mean, that's a nice question, and I will think about it. But my general answer would be that I just really enjoy interviewing people and learning their stories. So I do find that part of the job really interesting.
Awesome, awesome. Okay, so now we're getting close towards the end of our little chat. And notice I don't call it an interview, it's more of a chat because we're just having a dialogue. You know, what is next for Paula Slier? I mean, what would you hope to be doing in your career? I mean, are you running the Middle East hub of Newshound Media? Is that how it works?
So I have a company. My company is called Newshound Media. It's based in the Middle East, and I have people working for me, and we have stringers across the Middle East. So we provide journalists and production services from Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Gaza, and Africa, particularly North Africa, from Egypt, Algeria, South Africa as well. So that's the one hat I wear as the owner of NewsHound Media. The other hat is I'm the Middle East Bureau Chief for Russia Today. So I work as one of their journalists that goes to dangerous areas, but predominantly covers the Middle East region for them. Sometimes the hats are at loggerheads, like sometimes I find I would like to have more time to run the company, and sometimes I'd like to have more time to kind of be the journalist in the danger zones. But I've been lucky, and they both bring out different parts of my personality and different parts of my intelligence, or where I need to learn. I'm stronger in some areas and weaker in others. So where would I like to go? I sometimes, to be honest, we've been talking about how exciting it is going to all these dangerous areas. The truth is sometimes it gets a little bit too much. I think no one's asked me that question, but people often ask me the question of, you know, what are the sacrifices you make and what is the price you pay? And the sacrifices you make is that your friends can never rely on you to be at a dinner party. They can give you an invitation for next Friday night, and you say, I'm definitely going to be there. And until that Friday night and they open their front door and you're standing there, they cannot be sure that you're going to come. And even further, even when you're sitting at the dinner table on Friday night, they can't be sure that you're going to stay there until the end of the dinner. It seriously does work like that. It's very exciting. You know, you get a phone call and you've got to drop everything, you've got to run. But the price you pay is that it's hard to really have a personal life, and your friends have to be particularly understanding, and your family has to be particularly understanding. So sometimes I think it's a little bit too much, and sometimes I want to take a back step. And maybe that's why a lot of young women ask me, like, how would one be a war correspondent and have a family and children? And the truth is, a lot of women manage it, but a lot of women also land up not managing it and choose one or the other. It is a very difficult career to balance the two parts of one's life. So I would like to learn how to balance it better. I would like to also continue reporting from these areas, but sometimes I want to report from happier stories. Someone asked me, or there was some point earlier about doing more feel-good stories, and you asked me the question as well. I do think that there's a role for journalism, that we can do good stories. We just need, I don't know where the circle begins. I don't know if the public needs to have a demand on journalists that they want those kind of stories, or if we need to just start giving you those kind of stories, and we'll all learn together to stop insisting that the only news that makes it into the headlines is the sensationalist, gory, bloody stories.
Sure. Well, I mean,
yeah.
If I can just say that, you know, look, the reason why we do these interview series is because we want to promote problem solving and to show kids that problems are being solved without particularly using numbers, because, you know, maths is not just about sums, it's also about real life problems, and you face these sort of decisions every single day, multiple times per day, so technically you're actually a very good mathematician. Do you think we are going to see Paula, the travel consultant, who's going to be writing about the beautiful countryside in the Ukraine as opposed to being a war correspondent? Is that your way of winding down towards the end?
Hey, Stephen, can I ask you that question? Do you see me one day reporting from Ukraine while there's a war going on about how lush and green the fields of Ukraine are?
I highly doubt that. So in other words, retirement's not
I don't see that. The truth is, I don't see that, because maybe I think I would like to. Maybe there's a way of being a correspondent in these dangerous areas, and I'm not quite sure, somehow using it to make good. I know that the most meaningful stories for me have been when I went, like I said earlier, to earthquake zones, and when I've gone to places where, as a journalist, we could play a very specific role to help people. So, you know, if I can go to, but I do it anyway, but maybe I want to focus more on that. Like if I go to Afghanistan to do the stories about the children who are in the orphanage because their parents were killed by the last war. Maybe if I could learn, and it's not about learning, it's about it's about the channels wanting to tell those kind of stories, but to tell more stories that are human stories, that can touch people around the world, and maybe in some small way can help make a difference in some people's lives.
One last question from me, and maybe the panel that are here and also people who are watching on YouTube, if they want to send through any questions. To see trauma on a regular basis, surely that impacts on an emotional point of view, and some people might consider counseling, people might consider trauma debriefing. Do you experience that at all? I mean, is it affecting you? Do you feel that you're becoming a harder person because of what you see?
The funny thing is, when I became a journalist, I remember one of my first news editors saying to me, "You're going to become cynical, you know, and you're going to become harder." And I actually thought that was going to happen. I thought I would become. We spoke about being desensitized, but the funny thing is, it's the opposite is happening to me, and I have no idea why. I have found that the more I'm going to these horror stories and these dangerous places, the more it's affecting me. It's easier for me now to be moved to tears when I interview a woman who's lost a child than it was 10, 15 years ago. That might just be my personal journey. On a very personal level, I have found that I'm becoming softer and more touched by stories that are tragic than I did when I started out. But I have to be honest and tell you that I am becoming more afraid. You know, I think there's something truthful about saying that when you're young, you don't really believe that you're going to, you go to a dangerous area and you're kind of naive, you know, I'll never be injured, I can do anything. And I think as you get older, maybe we also become wiser and we have more to lose. It's for example, I don't have children. I'm not sure I could continue with this kind of career if I had children. Would I want to be going to Afghanistan and risking my life when I know I have children at home that are waiting for me to come back? So it's a very real question. So I am more afraid. I think I'm more, and because you see a lot of horror, it becomes more real that these things actually do happen. You can actually be injured or worse in these environments.
Sure.
So constant journey.
Tough decisions to be made. Well, I'd like to thank you so much for giving of your time. I know that you're a very busy woman. And I don't know about the rest of the panel, but I found the chat absolutely scintillating. You have so much information, and I like the way you approach your answers. You're very truthful and honest. You know, you should go into journalism. Oh, you already are a journalist. But I mean, I found it absolutely fascinating for the kinds of things that you've shared with us, and I can see that from a problem-solving point of view, just those aspects play a huge role in what you do, and I'm in awe of the amount of problem solving that you would have to use on a daily basis. I'm not conscious of the danger that you put yourself under, but I can understand the adrenaline rush. I can see that, but it's a very interesting career, and I hope that people who are watching out there today, or who are going to watch it later on YouTube if they've missed the live broadcast, will certainly want to know more about journalism, and hopefully if they have any questions they can send them to me and I'll pass them on to Paula so that you can get some answers. But thank you so much for your time, and I will make sure that we send you all the photographs that we were snapping away during the interview, and I'll send you the links for the talk as well. All right. So I'm going to stop the broadcast. Yeah? You're saying?
It was my pleasure, and it was my pleasure, and I'm reading some of the comments, and it was lovely. Thank you all so much for taking the time to be part of the conversation.
Oh, in fact, Maria said you should be writing a book. When can we expect that?
I know, but the problem with that is time. I know. I keep thinking I should write this book. If anybody has an answer on how to fit more hours into the day, I'm all ears.
So am I. If you can find that answer, I would have that too. You know, maybe you'll find someone who'll write the book for you. I mean, after all, isn't that how journalism works?
Yeah. You just read all my tweets and I'll put it into a book.
That could be an interesting approach. It's a very interesting book. You never know. All right,
I'm enjoying the comments. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'm going to stop the broadcast here,